Gaming as a medium is highly iterative. Like a coral reef, everything is built on the bones of what came before, remixing and modifying as needed to produce something even greater. Even allowing for that, though, there are games that pay homage to their forebears, and there are games that are a few name changes away from copyright infringement, and that's where our subject today, Mortal Shell, falls. Mortal Shell is miniature Dark Souls. Basically, every single facet of this game is a painstakingly crafted imitation of From Software's signature RPG series, just on a smaller scale. The story, visuals, gameplay, everything. The number of new ideas Mortal Shell brings to the table can be counted on one hand. It's a well-executed imitation, to be sure, polished and well put together, but it's a replica nonetheless, right down to having the player exit the tutorial area by being unceremoniously kidnapped by a giant animal with no explanation. It's set in the moldering remnants of a dying fantasy world populated almost exclusively by hostile monsters, with your only real ally being a mysterious stoic lady who helps you level up and only speaks in cryptic pseudo-spiritual gibberish.
Many died dragging that beast down here. He served as a slave, a guardian, that they would worship unfettered, enshrined in ice. Can you blame them? The perversity of living has always been its ever-changing nature. So,
you can't even pause Mortal Shell. The game doesn't have the online features that sort of justify this in the Souls series, so there's no reason for it beyond, hey, Dark Souls did it, so we're going to do it too, context be damned. So we end up with this basic feature being stripped from the game for no reason beyond a tribute to its forebears, like the game design equivalent of an appendix. More specifically, I describe Mortal Shell this way. You know those really obnoxious FromSoft fans who are constantly gatekeeping the proper way to play Soulsborne games? Well, Mortal Shell is a game by those guys, for those guys. There's a distinct sense that the devs were trying to one-up FromSoft in terms of inaccessibility. For starters, as opaque as the lore of Dark Souls is, it at least starts you off with an intro cutscene. Not so with Mortal Shell. You're dropped in as a sort of undead skeleton/ghost thing, and everything after that is on you. If you're wondering, I gave up on trying to figure out the game's plot almost immediately. I know, call me a casual Philistine, but I have enough trouble with FromSoft's lore, so I'm sure you're not going to waste my time on the store brand version. This no casuals design philosophy extends to the class design. Mortal Shell has no character creation. Instead, your white wraith thing can possess corpses, acting as a sort of class system. You're given one for free at the start, and there's another 4 or so scattered around the game world. Mortal Shell doesn't have a leveling system either. Each class instead has a handful of unlockable skills you can purchase with souls, Tar, most of which don't actually improve your stats directly. Weapons are not tied to class, but there's also only like 5 of them to be unlocked, so it's not exactly an open-ended system. Unlike the classes, weapons actually do have proper stat upgrades, and I'd encourage you to find one as soon as possible because it really helps even the odds early on. The classes also don't actually function all that differently. As far as I could tell, unlike Dark Souls, the game doesn't have a magic system, so you can expect to be wading into melee regardless of what loadout you want. Class choice mostly only affects HP, stamina, and mana for special moves. There is a single unlockable ranged weapon, but its ammo is incredibly scarce, and it's clearly intended to supplement the melee weapons. The combat is where the whole Dark Souls purist thing is most evident, because it's basically a mechanical recreation of that playstyle where folks insist on fighting strictly in melee, underleveled, and reliant on dodge roll and parrying to avoid damage. Even basic enemies can kill you in a couple hits, and there are no shields to speak of, so you can either get good at parrying or learn to enjoy picking your teeth up off the floor. In what should be a theme for the rest of this video, combat in Mortal Shell should be thought of as Dark Souls, except where I note otherwise. The nuts and bolts of the combat system are an almost exact recreation of Dark Souls, albeit stripped down to the essentials. You have a fairly unforgiving stamina meter, and everything you do involves fairly lengthy animations, so time management and learning enemy attack patterns is key. It's extremely unforgiving, even more so than Dark Souls, and you can expect to struggle with even basic enemies early on. A single wrong move can easily kill you, and there's a real sense of weight to every attack. Mortal Shell also has a simple mana system called Resolve that fills from attacking enemies and can be used for special moves. You have a built-in parry, but the animation is extremely unforgiving, and even basic enemies have tricky timing. A successful parry will open up an enemy to a counterattack that consumes Resolve for one of a few possible effects, such as a life drain. Resolve can be used for special attacks that are tied to your specific weapon. There are a couple unique mechanics to Mortal Shell though. First is hardening. Basically, there's a dedicated button that will make your character instantly petrify with no lag or animation, becoming immune to all damage and blocking the next hit. Effectively, it acts as a sort of get out of damage free card and can interrupt enemy attacks that are otherwise unstoppable, which is a pretty big deal in a Souls-like combat system. The cooldown timer is pretty generous too, so it's clearly intended to be a major tool in the player's arsenal, which is why it's unfortunate that I kept forgetting that it existed. Blame all the Soulsborne muscle memory, I guess. Mortal Shell also has a sort of live system of all things. When you hit 0 HP, instead of dying, your skeleton/ghost dude will instead be booted out of the shell you're possessing. When you're in this state, your HP is dropped so low that basically everything kills you in one hit, though everything else is still functional, and you can apparently play the entire game like this if you're so inclined. Read A Complete and Utter Masochist. As the Wraith, if you can make it back to your shell without taking a hit, you can hop back into the driver's seat at full health and pick up right where you left off. It's a pretty tense feeling trying to regain your body while dodging attacks, but once you get used to it, it becomes pretty easy. Most enemies move pretty slowly, so luring them away for a bit, then doubling back for your body is much easier than just making a beeline for it. You can only do this once though, get reduced to 0 HP again, and it's instant death, at least in normal circumstances. All of the classes can unlock an ability that lets them regain the extra life after killing 10 enemies, and I'd recommend that be the first thing you unlock because it lets you keep chugging along almost indefinitely as long as you don't get too careless. Healing is another area where Mortal Shell's designers looked at Dark Souls and thought this isn't punishing enough. There is no Estus Flask equivalent. You will be forced to rely entirely on consumables or the occasional parry lifesteal to get by. Consumables also don't heal much. Fortunately though, they do respawn, but on a fairly long timer. Healing is really scarce in Mortal Shell, which is another reason I wholeheartedly recommend getting the aforementioned perk as soon as possible. Regaining your shell refills your health, so if you can just keep doing that over and over, then you should be good on the health front. Besides health consumables, basically the only items on offer are passive buffs, and even those are really situational, like providing a boost to your next parry. There aren't any opportunities to use items in creative ways. Mortal Shell considers melee duels the only acceptable form of combat, apparently. I do have to admit the presentation is quite nice. This game was made by a pretty small team as I understand it, but you wouldn't think so just looking at it. While it doesn't have like ultra AAA graphics, it looks great by the standards of a middle shelf type game. The environment design conveys a sense of forlorn hopelessness tinged with menace, even if it's not super imaginative in its art style. Both enemies and the player have elaborately detailed combat animations that look great in action, driving home that sense of weight and impact the Souls-like genre thrives on. Again, all of it is copied from Dark Souls almost exactly, but it is well executed. The high production values are impressive, but they can't do much to disguise a dearth of content, and that's one of Mortal Shell's biggest shortcomings. It's not immediately obvious because the game's overworld is maze-like and densely populated with enemies, but the environments in Mortal Shell are rather small, and I don't mean just in comparison to big budget AAA sandboxes. There's the central swamp world that links 3 fairly short dungeons, then a final boss, and that's your lot. I get that game length is a rather touchy subject these days, but if you're a Dark Souls vet, I would expect you to be able to blaze through this in 8 hours or less. The game is short enough that it kind of renders the class switch system pointless. I spent the majority of the game as the Knight class, and by the time I had unlocked everything on offer in the upgrade menu, I was most of the way through the game. The level up NPC then none too subtly started hinting that I should try the other classes, and all I could think was, why should I? You're basically asking me to kneecap myself for the final leg of the game for no reason. Same deal with weapons actually. Once you find enough upgrade materials to max your weapon out, you're probably near the end already, so you might as well just stick with it for the final stretch. I think it would have made more sense to just make the classes more materially distinct and have the player just pick one at the start and stick with it, because my gut tells me that's probably what most players did anyway. What else is there to say really? For all my pointless pontificating on the mechanics, I really could have left this review at "It's mini Dark Souls." I don't want to come off as too harsh here. Mortal Shell is not a bad game per se, but I don't really see a reason for it to exist. Plenty of smaller smaller games have taken inspiration from the Dark Souls formula and put their own spin on it, like Hollow Knight or Blasphemous. There's a lot of effort and technical competence on display here, absolutely, but this game really needed some kind of angle to set it apart from its obvious inspiration. It really is just a smaller, stripped-down replica of Dark Souls, a perfectly functional one, but a replica nonetheless. And I think most Dark Souls fans would rather just play Dark Souls again, or more likely one of the derivations thereof that FromSoft have been cranking out for like 15 years now. Between the short length, bare-bones narrative, and rote imitation, Mortal Shell almost feels more like a portfolio piece or a proof of concept more than it does a proper finished product, and the few new ideas it does have don't have enough room to breathe. If you're a complete FromSoft fanatic, jonesing for new content while waiting for the Elden Ring DLC to drop, this will probably scratch that itch, but ultimately it's just a tribute act, and I wonder how many people want that when the original is still cranking out hits.